Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
Asking questions, yes, is a wonderful way to begin to delve into what are people thinking and feeling. You raise a very good point about how salespeople can often be very tempted. They go in with not only the gun loaded, but the trigger already suppressed partially. Like they're just looking for that one opportunity, that crack to just start unloading. Essentially, our brains are wired to look for information that confirms what we already believe, and our brains are wired to discard information that contradicts what we already believe.
Hello Sales Nation, my name is Will Bryan and I'm the host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most downloaded B2B sales show. On today's episode, we have a legend. He's been on the show a couple of times now, Michael Reddington. He is a forensic interviewer and you can find out more about him over at inquasive.com. And on today's episode of the show, we're getting into how you can understand a buyer better by using the techniques of enhanced questioning. There's tons to go out in this interview. I really enjoyed recording with Michael, and that probably comes across in the show itself. And with that said, let's jump right into it. So I want to dive into, on today's episode, how we can better understand our buyers, how we can understand perhaps what they're thinking, but not perhaps what they're selling. And hopefully we can do this via asking questions as opposed to resorting to brain scans, lie detectors, or anything else along those lines. So to use a computer analogy here, is asking questions the best kind of non-invasive way that we have to interface with someone else's brain?
It certainly can be, assuming we don't have a functional MRI machine in our back pocket that we could just put on people every time we have conversations. Asking questions, yes, is a wonderful way to begin to delve into what are people thinking and feeling. Now, it's a double-edged sword. It's important to remember that questions can be perceived as invitations or attacks. So questions that are perceived to be more invitational should encourage people to share more information. And the opposite is true. If people feel attacked, they're going to be on guard. So what we really find is great questions are a great way in order to help understand what people have going on inside. Poor questions can have more than an equal opposite effects to do more damage. Really the combination, especially in the world of B2B sales and business development, it's that combination of illustrating our expertise along with asking our questions that really makes the biggest difference. Is if this is an enterprise level conversation that it could take 6 to 18 months to close the deal, then somebody is certainly trusting within us in our organization that we have a level of expertise that is superior to our competitors and they can rely on throughout our relationship. So if all we do is fire questions at people, we're not doing anything to illustrate our expertise there. So it's really, if we want people to share information, we have to help them choose to feel comfortable doing so. So that combination of what we like to say, illustrate before you investigate, really helps us accomplish that.
So this reminds me of an analogy that's used all the time in sales training. And I'm going to ask you whether this is a good analogy or a bad analogy in a second. But people use this analogy of a doctor. So a doctor sat there, someone comes into the doctor's office and the doctor just asks question with no emotion. They don't jump at this opportunity to diagnose the patient. They'll go a few steps deeper and the patient is happy, I guess, because they're assuming authority and expertise. When they walk into the room, they assume that, and that might be why some of this works. So the doctor asks questions, and then comes up with a result at the end. What salespeople tend to do, and the point of the analogy is that a salesperson will ask one question, find the slightest hint of a need, and then they'll throw a pitch down the buyer's throat. Now, is this doctor analogy perhaps not the best analogy? Because as you're describing here, we need to both ask questions and increase this perceived level of authority and expertise in a conversation. And if we did go into it like a doctor, we'd be missing out on that side of the equation, and so none of this would be effective.
Yes, with opportunities. And I have tons of recency bias for this example because I was just at the doctor's office yesterday. So you raise a very good point about how salespeople can often be very tempted. They go in with not only the gun loaded, but the trigger already suppressed partially. Like they're just looking for that one opportunity, that crack to just start unloading. which can be a very dangerous approach to take. And on the doctor side, and for all of your listeners that may be in the medical field, I really apologize to any of them that I may alienate in the next 10 seconds, because that's not my intention. I find that often doctors are not good listeners. And often doctors ask ineffectual questions. Not always. I don't want to say always. And certainly when you get into more specialty scenarios and in greater risk scenarios, that calculus changes some. But on average, to your point, when we go to the doctor, we do assume their authority, which is one of the 7 automatic mechanisms of persuasion. So we're already more malleable when that conversation starts. And 2, we generally go to the doctors expecting that they will have answers for us. So we go in with the positive expectation that authority is kicking in. So even if they did make us wait 45 minutes in a little room all by ourselves before they walk in, they have the table set for them to have favorable results with us. However, often, to your point, doctors walk in, they ask a handful of bullet point style questions. They may or may not even be looking at us while they ask the questions. They're typing notes into their computer or writing them down. And oftentimes it's easy for them to fall into a check the box mentality, because really they're trying to diagnose and prescribe. So the quicker they can diagnose and prescribe, the quicker they can get to the person in the next room, and the quicker they can run the business of being a doctor. Now, I understand all of those challenges for being a doctor, so hopefully I didn't offend anybody who is a doctor. It's just that when you look at the competing motivations of the world that they're in. So when we flash it back to sales professionals, yes, if we walk in and we just bullet point questions to people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no emotion, no acknowledgement, no illustration. I think one of the analogies I made in our last conversation was, in the investigative world here in the United States, we have the Miranda warning. So everybody that's watched any American TV, you have the right to remain silent. Well, often buyers feel the same way, because they know we're digging, and they know that when we find something of value that we're going to hammer on it until we think we can convince them. And that approach of pitching or convincing becomes very problematic, because now there's any number of biases. Confirmation bias starts, where we start interpreting what somebody is communicating differently than maybe what they actually mean. We start convincing ourselves there's an opportunity there that may not be actually there. So taking the time to strategically incorporate illustrations of our expertise, illustrations of our understanding of their world with important questions, like questions that actually get to the meat of what we're talking about. Often when we ask questions, we want to ask questions that cause people to think differently, not questions that line up with what every single business development representative for every single need that they buy for have asked them. Like, every time somebody asks what keeps you up at night, I feel like an angel loses its wings. Like, there's better ways to do this.
Okay, so a few things here. I want to get into how we can deal with perhaps going into an environment where, if you're into a doctor's environment, I think you use the phrase positive expectation that you're going to get an outcome that you want. How we can deal with that if we go into a sales call or a sales meeting where the buyer might be thinking, I want to get rid of this individual as quick as possible. I also want to talk about questions that can help people think differently. I've done actually a few shows on a similar topic to that recently. So that's super top of mind and super important. But top of the list of things I want to run through, Michael, people will have heard this phrase before, but I'm not sure everyone understands it, and I think it's incredibly important for sales. What is confirmation bias? Can you give us a definition of what it is, and then so we can look out for it in our own conversations?
Certainly. So I'll try not to geek out too much. Essentially, our brains are wired to look for information that confirms what we already believe, and our brains are wired to discard information that contradicts what we already believe. So for as wonderful and powerful as our brains love comfort and consistency more than anything else. So when we think, we have roughly 163 cognitive biases, and many operate the way that confirmation bias does. What is literally the fastest and the most comfortable way for us to feel at ease with the situation we're in and reinforce what we already think and believe. So in the world of interview and interrogation, one of the things that one of the areas where confirmation bias comes up the most is in this whole concept of reading nonverbal communication. Like, believe it or not, if somebody scratches their nose, it might itch.
Sure.
If somebody crosses their arms, they might be cold. But if we go into a conversation saying, well, I'm going to catch Will lying, then the first time you pick up your pen and click it, I say, well, look, he's lying. No, he just needs to make sure his pen was on because he's going to take notes. So that's really where confirmation bias comes in. Whether we realize it or not, we're looking for indications that validate the expectations we had prior to the conversation. And that, although it can save us time, it can be really dangerous in a lot of ways.
So I think we might have touched on this in the previous episode. How do we deal with confirmation biases in a nutshell? Is it we look for, I think you mentioned looking for like a baseline of behavior and then making assumptions on that as opposed to going into things with preconceived ideas?
Two ways, and we may have touched on them both previously, so I'll be quick just in case. If we're talking about reading behavior, then yes, establishing that baseline first. Even though you and I have talked before, a lot has transpired in our lives between the last time we spoke. So at the beginning of this conversation, we might interact a little differently. That might not necessarily indicate anything. So I need to, if we were doing this in this conversation, we would need to establish that norm before making assumptions. When it comes to preparing for the conversation, oftentimes, especially in a B2B sales world, people fall in love, and rightfully so, with what they sell. So when they go into these conversations, they're really confident that they are the best sales rep and this is the best product and they do work for the best company and all of these things. And I believe it was CEB, which now may be Gartner, that did a research study that essentially showed, and I'm drastically over summarizing, that on average, when we think of our differentiating factors, the market perceives roughly 14% of what we perceive to be a differentiating factor as actually a differentiating factor. So one of the ways that we try to combat this overconfidence as it relates to confirmation bias is as I plan to engage with a customer and as I begin to strategize what questioning track I may take, is in a strategic preparation scenario, the first question I ask myself is, why shouldn't they buy what I'm selling? Not why should they? Because if I say why should they, crank up the confirmation bias. But now if I say, why shouldn't they buy what I'm selling, it forces me to have an uncomfortable conversation and think from their perspective all the reasons why they shouldn't, which then helps me strategically prepare, also limits confirmation bias. There's a sister question with that I like to ask. And again, this is internal preparation. Like I wouldn't actually ask a customer this, which is, why haven't they already purchased what I'm selling? And I think we touched on this in the last call as well. There's generally two umbrella answers to that. Either they didn't know it was an option or they don't perceive the value. So those are ways that we try to help limit the confirmation bias, as well as, those mental checkpoints throughout the conversation. Is this what I'm really hearing? Is there something I need to clarify?
I love it because most old school sales training is, especially from the mindset motivation perspective, is just get in the zone, just you're the best, you can do this and all this kind of stuff. It might work if you're selling a car perhaps, but if you're selling to someone and there's going to be multiple meetings over multiple weeks or months, then clearly that initial bombardment of excitement and one-sidedness is going to be ineffective as it goes throughout the sales cycle. And also what you're describing here is a great way to just prime yourself to be ready for objections that come up. Even if it could be simple, just make a few squiggles on a piece of paper before you go in of, why wouldn't they buy? And then you've immediately primed your brain to be quicker to respond to, because your subconscious is going to be working on the background of how to deal with some of these objections. You're priming yourself to be able to handle them seamlessly and smoothly. And you're pulling me into the next question here, which is, how do we cope with a scenario where the buyer, perhaps the first time we spoke to them, someone else has set up a meeting and they're having to come in, or perhaps an end user of our product has been trying to become a champion within the organization for us, and it's the first time we're sitting down with the CFO who actually has the budget, and they don't really care about anything that we're doing, and they're not really sold on it. They're just being polite at this moment in time. How do we deal with that scenario, and how do we, to tie it into something else I wanted to get to as well, how do we start to ask this CFO questions that perhaps helps them think differently, both about what we're doing and the opportunities to improve what they're doing?
Great question. And I promise I won't forget it. I want to just circle back half a second when you said that the last approach we talked about helps prime the brain to respond to objections. Again, I'll see you in raise. You're 100% correct. And it helps us prepare to take them away before they're ever verbalized. So now I can change my approach, what I say, the order I say it all. So I can actually start to limit them and take them away before I have to experience them. So there's an extra benefit there. Now returning to the question that you did want me to answer. When we sit down to somebody who, let's be honest, by rights should be reluctant to share information with us. That's nothing personal. Like, that's the role that they have. There's a reason why we had to go through 4 gatekeepers just to get to them. The good news is we're here. They wouldn't be spending their time with us if there wasn't some inkling of potential value. So let's focus on what we do have instead of focus on what we don't have. So focusing on what we do have, at least for a period of time, we have a quasi-attentive audience, to say the least, that has some initial interest in what we may be offering. Again, when we think back to that, as you mentioned, that overconfidence, I am the greatest, here I come mentality, that can absolutely lead to a self-servicing conversation that is mostly bragging and arrogance. Yeah. Mr. CFO, thank you for taking the time. I know you're really busy, so let me take the next 6 minutes to tell you how awesome I am, my company is, in my product or software services, and here we go. And that can be really off-putting to people. So again, champions of research, CEB's research that they published in the Challenger sale, I believe, is where I got the last research study from that I mentioned. For the record, I have no relationship with them. They don't know that I'm alive. Neither does this organization I'm about to mention. And I think I may have mentioned them on the last call. When the RAIN Group did a bunch of their research work, one of the things that they established was the 3 steps for connecting with customers is resonate, differentiate, substantiate. And all too often, sales reps skip the resonation point. They start with either differentiate or substantiate. Let me tell you why I'm awesome, or let me tell you why I'm different. And it's really skipping ahead. I don't know if it was, I should know this, whether it was Zig Ziglar or Dale Carnegie or whoever was the one that said, people, Stephen Covey, people don't care about you until they know that you care about them. Whoever deserves credit for saying that is true. So when we talk about the concept of illustrate before you investigate, really illustrating our understanding of somebody else's world, whether it is what they experience, their employees experience, their customers experience, by showing an understanding of their world first. Now they think, okay, Will gets me. And it's really about being a conversational expert, not a detailed expert. But if we can share that at the beginning of the conversation, they think Will gets me. As soon as they think Will gets me, the guard comes down just a little bit. One of the other things we do when we talk about the 7 automatic mechanisms of persuasion is we love to use illustrations that are spoken in the plural. Essentially, the word you is one of the most dangerous words in the English language. So you're Mr. CFO. This is your castle. And I walk in and say, so let me ask you a question. Are you aware? What do you see? What do you struggle with? Every time I say the word you, I'm poking your self-image. And if we have a relationship, maybe it's not a problem. But if this is the first time we're meeting, probably not going to go well. So what I need to do is find one quick illustration that enhances the perception of my credibility while placing you in a position where you feel like you're comfortable answering because other people in similar positions have. So as we make this up for the purpose of this conversation, I may say, so, Will, as I think back to conversations I've had with CFOs over the last 6 months, generally we find that one of the issues they have is validating some of the opportunities that their staff brings to them with what they're seeing in the market and lining that up with the budget because of their scope of focus and everything they're responsible for. And literally, I watch you in this situation. And when you do this, that just tells me I resonated. So now I'm going to come back and ask the question. And I guess I might be stealing a little bit here. The concept of assumptive closes, asking assumptive questions at the close, is generally something we don't teach, especially in B2B enterprise level sales. That's a great way to 86 a relationship that we spent months or years working on. But by asking assumptive questions much earlier in the conversation, we can encourage people to share more information. So let's say this is a software product that is supposed to add efficiency to the team and save time. And that's what we're talking about here. So now maybe the question that I asked you coming right off of that illustration could be, so Will, in the essence of time, really the first question I would like to ask you is let me do it this way. How many of your coaching conversations with your staff in the last year have involved the phrase, "that's taking up too much of my time"? And as soon as he stops to think about that, I know it's happened at least once. Yep. And now we can start expanding the conversation from there.
Are there any other? So I love the examples. I was hesitant. I was trying not to jump into any of it, and it's difficult for me because there's a few things I want to touch on this. But before we do that, is there any other questions, or because it seems like it didn't seem like you were making that up on the spot. It seems like these kind of questions, there's at least a framework or a structure that you added a story and a narrative to. Are there any other frameworks or structures of questions that we should be asking, especially on this point of getting an individual to drop their guard?
One of the things we think about is, if we use the analogy of a dartboard, I don't want to throw my first dart. I probably don't want to throw my first 5 or 6 darts right at the bullseye. Now, honestly, if you and I were playing darts, I probably wouldn't hit it anyway. But for the purpose of this analogy, if we think about the bullseye, it's the hardest place to hit on the target. And for our prospects or customers, it's the same. That's where they're likely going to have their most resistance. So what we think about doing is, instead of leading with our most important question, we want to lead to our most important question. Because now we can start asking a series of questions that get their wheels spinning and get them to consider things that maybe they haven't previously, that now lead us naturally into where we want to go. In previous generations of sales training may have taught that whole get 10 yeses in a row and then ask what you want because you've now locked them into saying yes. That feels so inauthentic, and people are aware of that. And again, if somebody catches it, it feels like a trap. But now if we're actually asking a series of questions, literally if we stop and think, if in order for him to so again, quoting Rain, there's 3 buyer mentalities: problem solving, future seeking, or currently content. So if somebody's currently content, we need them to see either a problem or think about the future. And generally it's easier to flip them to future seeking than it is to problem solving. If you're happy, why would I want to try to convince you have a problem? That sounds like a dangerous proposition to me, right? So if we just think about problem solving or future seeking, if I want you to buy my software as a service, well, I need you to see that there's an opportunity. But if I need you to see that there's an opportunity, let me start backstepping that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels and start asking myself, if these were stairs, in what order do you need to step on what stairs? So you make up your own mind. Oh yeah, I hadn't thought about it this way. Maybe there really is an opportunity. So I don't know if I answered your question directly, but that's really how we think about it.
How much of this, clearly you're an expert at this, so I'm sure you could do 99% of it just sat in the room with an individual. But how much for the mere mortal salesperson, Michael, how much of this is prepared ahead of time of, I'm going to ask this question, see where we go from here, then maybe ask these next few questions? Should we be writing this out before we go into a meeting if we know it might be a little bit of a frosty reception?
I still do. And the reason why I still do is, when we think about any potentially contentious conversation, any conversation that could go off the rails one way or another, the ingredients are there. All it needs is a spark. The emotional roller coaster that could occur during that conversation. There are so many variables that if I try to address all of those variables on the fly in the moment, I could be taxing my brain beyond its capability, which people who know me are going to chuckle at that response. But it can be taxing my brain past its capability and causing me to miss very important opportunities. So really what I want to try to do is I want to limit the number of variables I have to account for. Because if I get stuck talking to myself in the middle of our sales meeting, then I'm missing all kinds of opportunities that you could be providing me. So I'm not going to sit here and tell people they need to have a script, because then they just get too locked in and they lose the ability to think on their own. But what we should do is we should look at least planning the first 2, 3, 4 questions we think we're going to ask, and anticipate what the likely answers are going to be. So that way we can begin chaining them together in a way that feels authentic and I just lost my word as we were talking. In a way that feels authentic and conversational, there it is, as opposed to pre-planned, sit down, I have this list of questions I'm going to ask you.
Yeah, so I love this. And I want you to give me honest feedback in a second when I pose this question to you. But developing a conversation, it's almost counterintuitive that it's perhaps a good starting point to have a few questions. And this is exactly what I do both on the podcast and then when I'm on sales meetings and sales calls as well. So probably, I think I sent it this morning. I can't remember. I sent Michael a couple of kind of where we'll start the conversation and the overall topic of the show. And then everything that I write down from that point then turns it to a conversation. I just write down keywords that I want to come back to. So on the page now, I've got positive expectation, being on guard, 163, which I think was the number of cognitive biases that you mentioned earlier on, and a few other notes as well. So it almost seems counterintuitive that to drive a conversation that's going back and forth and to active listen and to do all these things that we know we're supposed to do, to have a few primers is useful. So am I going about this the right way because I do this for sales calls as well. Am I going about this for the right way, Michael, or is there anything I should do to improve the ability to, I guess, build that little bit of rapport when I click on a podcast or a sales call and then dive into to generate a conversation on the back of it?
A lot of that's going to be contextually based. On the whole, everything you just said sounds great to me. That being said, we're both individuals. So what works for me and what works for you can be a little bit different. And then even with who we're interacting with, they might have different needs. So yes, today you gave me a little bit of a heads up on what we were talking about. Thank you. I appreciate that. But we've met before. So today we didn't need to do a whole lot of rapport building. But if I was somebody who you had never met before and you're like, well, so now maybe 2 or 3 minutes of rapport would be more helpful before jumping in. So some of it is certainly contextually important to understand. Who are we talking to? What are we talking about? Generally speaking, when we think about there's roughly 6 categories that can impact communication. So who are you and who am I? What's the biography and history we bring into this? What's our relationship? What's the topic that we're going to be talking about? What are the potential rewards or consequences associated with that topic? And what's the surrounding environment? So you and I aren't sitting in a coffee shop, cafe, pub. So there's not a lot of things going on around us right now that we have to account for. But when we look at those 6 factors, as we consider before the conversation, how am I going to communicate with this individual based on these 6 and how might these 6 interact? Again, it gets back to the concept of how do I limit and account for as many variables as possible so I can focus what cognitive resources I do have in the right spots at the right time.
Right. So let me paint you a scenario here, and I'll put the blame on us for this scenario existing. We've gone through our questions, we've built rapport, we've lined them up so that we are teeing the buyer up to see what we see, that we can genuinely add this value, and they haven't quite sussed it out yet. But we get to the end of these questions, and they still don't see it. There's still a transformation that needs to happen in their brain for them to even understand what we're doing. And of course, it's our fault because we have the burden of knowledge. We've seen this many times before. Perhaps they haven't seen it. Perhaps we didn't account for the environment or another variable that we perhaps could have done in hindsight. Is there any way to, I guess, almost like reset a conversation, or any way to metaphorically shake someone into seeing what is clearly, for everyone else in the room, it's clear to them, but this individual isn't quite seeing it yet?
Yes. And again, some of these will be contextually appropriate for different people in different scenarios. I love the fact that you said it's our fault, because it is. It's the lowest common denominator. If I had 10 different sales meetings and 10 of them, they couldn't see what I was saying, like, I'm the only commonality in those 10 conversations. It has to be my fault. Not everyone is open to that thought process. So I love hearing that. I will give credit back to the RAIN group. Typically, when we follow that resonate, differentiate, substantiate process, we see far fewer issues with people just not getting it. It will happen, but we feel it far fewer. When it comes to actually resetting the conversation, there's several ways to do it. One that I like is oftentimes we might ask somebody the question, what questions do you have? But we don't realize that when we ask somebody, what questions do you have? They might not be motivated to ask a question, number one. They might not care enough. Or number two, they might not want to because they feel like if they ask a question, that means they weren't paying attention, they weren't smart enough. And we don't want to put their self-image on the spot like that. So we flip the script. Oftentimes, instead of saying, Will, do you have any questions? I'll say, Will, I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you. I've come to understand that sometimes things make a lot of sense up here, but by the time they come out here, they might not be as clear. So let me ask you this. What questions did I create? And now when I say what questions did I create, I'm putting it on me. It's not on you. It's no longer about you didn't listen or you couldn't keep up. Now it's kind of a coy way of me saying, so how did I screw that up? And letting them feel like it's easier to ask questions because now the questions are predicated on my delivery, not their listening skills. Another technique that I'll use a lot is if I'm not getting questions, I will say, and it's got to be authentic. Like, I don't want to make this up and I don't want to lie. And I don't want to encourage anybody to make stuff up or lie because it will come back at us at some point in time. Murphy's Law, guaranteed. But what I will say is, well, I really appreciate your time. Often when we get to this point in the conversation, the question I'm asked the most is, and I'll ask the question for them. So, I might say often at this point, the question I'm asked the most is, Mike, how long does implementation honestly take? And what is the average learning curve for somebody to really be successful with this software? And I'll throw that question out. And if it's a group of people, I'll literally watch them look at each other and nod their head.
I can visualize it, yeah.
I'll let it sit for 2 or 3 silent seconds, give somebody a chance to say something in case they want. And then if not, our feedback from our partners have been. And then I'll answer the question. So those are 2 ways. They're not the only 2 by any stretch, but for the purpose of our time, those are 2 ways that I like to do it. What questions did I create? And often at this point in the process, the question we get most often is.
I love it, especially with the second example. There's almost you're making the assumption. You're giving them the assumption that you are an expert and the knowledgeable one in the room as you say that. So I guess there's multiple layers to it. One thing you said here, Michael, we'll perhaps wrap up with this because this might be a topic in its own right. I can't remember the chap's name, but he is he's an expert in social engineering. I had him on a show a few years ago, and he talked about, and I'd never pondered on this before. We talked about this, and there's probably a framework to describe it. I'm going to butcher it now. We talked about this process when we talk about the effectiveness of communication, of you think something and then you're using your own upbringing and social norms and all kind of things to formulate it into words. They then come out of your mouth, and now as we record here, it goes into a microphone. Then it's compressed, because a lot of people are doing video calls right now, video meetings, so this might be relevant. It gets compressed and crushed depending on the quality of the microphone. The legibility might change as well. Then it goes over the internet. Then there's a delay by the time you actually hear it. Skype, Microsoft Teams is pretty good for this, but there is that delay. Then you hear it. Then it comes in for your earphones. You might have good earphones, you might have bad earphones, which affect things as well. Then your ability, how much time you spent listening to English people with an English accent can affect all of this as well. And then you interpret it with your own upbringing and social norms and cognitive biases. And what I've thought is now in your head, but it's like Chinese whispers with 20 different steps. So I've thrown a big subject at you here, but is there anything that we should be doing when we're asking questions, whether it is physically, as I kind of swallow the saliva in my mouth so it's more clear as I'm saying this, is there anything that we should physically be doing to make our questions more legible, whether it's talk slower, more pauses, anything like that, to make all the good intentions that we've talked about so far in this podcast actually land with the potential buyer that we're engaging with?
Yes, and you're right. This could be a topic all on its own.
That was a long question, wasn't it?
I think I'm with you. You can tell me how close I come by the time we get done. So one of the things that separates the best influential communicators in any industry or speciality is their contextual or situational awareness, taking in everything that's going on around them and adapting accordingly. So I've been very fortunate. I've traveled all over the world to teach. And when I go to England to teach, whether I'm in London or up in Nottingham, I have to not only account for the accent, but the different word choice and the different word meanings. And sometimes I can make light of it depending on the group and everybody chuckles. But I also have to make sure that I'm not over Americanizing what I say in that conversation. Also, there's the lag. Like you said, if this is a video call, if I'm talking with somebody who English is their second language, I can barely speak it to begin with, and it's their second language. It's the only one I speak. So I need to understand that not only are they going to have longer pauses as they translate in their mind, but I do need to enunciate clearer. So for me, whether it's faster, slower, louder, softer, enunciation, word choice, that needs to be tailored to the audience that I'm speaking to. What he said about how what we think and then say and is received and brought back goes through an almost innumerable amount of filters. When it comes to question generation, and this is something that in the beginning I literally wrote down and practiced until it became just repetitive muscle memory. One of the biggest problems we have with asking questions is often we ask questions based on what we want to say. We don't ask questions based on what the other person needs to experience in order to feel comfortable giving us the information that we need. So in order to address that, there is a 4-step process that we follow to create great questions. The first step in that process is to clarify what is the information that I actually need here. Once I have that clarified, then I'm going to ask myself, what fears or concerns may stop Will from sharing this information with me? Then I'm going to ask myself, what can I do prior to asking the questions to ease those concerns? Is that in my nonverbal behavior? Is that in my delivery? Is that the illustration I use prior to setting up the question? How do I ease that concern? Then step 4 is phrase the question. So now I'm working really hard to phrase that question in a way that is most likely to address their concerns and get me to the actual information I really need to be successful.
So I know I've not asked you to do this, so I'm kind of putting you on the spot a little bit, but do you have any feedback on the questions that I've been asking you? And clearly, I know you've not been consciously processing them from this perspective, but do I do anything that the audience will notice that I should not do so that they can also not do it as I ask a terrible question, a terribly structured question to ask feedback about my question and asking skills?
I think the real question you're asking me is, do I want to be invited back on the show?
No, hard, open, honest feedback is always welcome.
No, I understand. I think you are wonderfully engaging and you're wonderfully disarming and clearly have a ton of experience asking lots of people different questions. And I also enjoy how you can take something that I say buried in one of my tangential answers and turn it into your next question or tie it into something else you want to ask. So all of those are good qualities. For me, the number one opportunity that I experience during our conversations is the run-on and compound nature of some of the questions. Generally, the best questions are the more concise questions. That doesn't mean yes or no. It's just generally, if we can ask it in 6 words or 13 words, let's ask it in 6 instead of 13. And the other is compound questions. A lot of times in sales and interviewing, even in coaching, we'll ask somebody 3 or 4 questions all at once. And that can scramble their brain as they try to think of what to say and in what order. It can cause us to get impatient with their answer because they started with what was important to them, not what was important to us. So we really like to work with, ask one question that we believe will set them on the path that we need to go. Then be quiet, because research shows the number one mistake most interviewers make and sales professionals fall into this category is interrupting, which you've done almost 0 of. So that's a huge compliment. So let them finish. Let them choose where to start their explanation, what information to include, and where to end. And then once they end, now we can start asking thoughtful follow-up questions. So one of the ways that I love to phrase questions is please walk me through. Because when we say please walk me through, that infers an expectation of detailed and chronological order, which makes it easier for us to keep that in line and figure out where to go next.
Love it. I love the way so I'm going to start using this. I love the way you framed my shit questions up with, the opportunity here in lies to solve the issue. Even just the way you say the word, the opportunity here is, as opposed to the way that you could improve and it would make things better. So it's not even just positively. Well, I guess you're doing what you're describing, which I'm struggling to do right now. You used one word rather than 15 to say the same thing. I guess for the audience, and I know you appreciate this, sometimes I ask a long-winded question because I'm trying to add context for people who are not listening to this, because this is a problem that I have, and this happens in sales, and we touched on it earlier on, this burden of knowledge. So you know that I know some of the stuff that I'm asking questions on, but I know that you know that I'm asking what seems like a simple question, because there'll be people in the audience who don't know that. So with that context, and this is the final thing we'll run through, Michael, how does all this change when we're in a big room with a CFO, there's end users, middle management, and people have different knowledge about what we're sharing and perhaps have a different interests in it as well? Is there a way should we always ask questions to the decision maker, or should we spread the questions around, and should we tailor our questions differently? How does this enhanced questioning, how does that change when there's more people in the room?
Great question. And thank you, by the way, for your previous compliment. I appreciate it. I don't want to ignore that. Thank you. When it comes to answering your question, hopefully this isn't a surprise. Hopefully, if we're going to be meeting with a group of people, this has been scheduled, we know, or at least have a logical assumption. If we walk into a room and we expected 1 and there's 9, we have that gulp. The same rules apply, but now we have to think about it on the fly. Assuming that we have any type of prior knowledge, we should have a plan. Especially when we're talking enterprise level, B2B sales, we shouldn't be winging anything. That we should be sitting down with our team and saying, based on our part in expertise, here's what we're relying upon each other to contribute, who's going to be the captain of this conversation and kind of lead the orchestra for who speaks when, so we don't trip over each other. We've got that set. Now let's look at our audience. And when we look at our audience, who can we expect to be there? And then we literally go through, what are their fields of expertise? What are their primary concerns going to be? What are reasons why each individual shouldn't want to do this? And now what we do is we come up with a plan where I'm stealing a phrase, which I may not have time to tell you the whole boring story, but I'm stealing a phrase called stay within your circle. A very long story short, it's something that a special forces operator I had the opportunity to do some work with taught me. He was taught in a school, it's called SEER school here in the United States, where they send people who are more likely to be captured and interrogated. So how do you survive, evade, resist, and escape? So when it came to being interviewed or interrogated or tortured, what they taught this group to do was stay within your circle. You have a story of why you're here and what you're doing here. No matter what they do to you, you've got to stay within that circle. So for us in sales, stay within our circle. What is the core message we need everybody in this room? At the end of this conversation, what do we want everybody walking away thinking, feeling, and doing? Okay, we got that. Now, how do we tie it in to the end user, to the budget guy, to the innovator, big picture strategy guy, whoever is in the room? And then, yes, I would recommend asking questions to everybody in the room. We don't want anyone to feel excluded. We don't want to come across as arrogant or better than anybody else. If any part of the sale we're trying to complete involves support and service, demonstrating our ability to connect with everybody in the room could be a vital component of creating expectations for the quality of our service and support. So really what we want everyone to do is leave our meeting, go into their own huddle after, and be on the same page from their own perspective about how, more so than not, this is a great opportunity. So by all means, I would not ignore anybody. And you never know on the other side of the table who is going to be your unexpected champion at the end of the day. Maybe it is the tech manager who walks in and says, my goodness, do you realize how many hours a month this would save my team? And now the CFO does the math and cha-ching. Or maybe it's the customer experience manager who sits down and says, do you have any idea how better positioned this would put? So giving everybody the opportunity to be the champion is not something we should overlook.
I love it. And it's a conversation for another time. But I like this idea of the circle, because we do get pulled one way and pulled the other. And there's almost a level of assertiveness that we need to have within a meeting, especially if we are hosting a meeting with a buying group. Part of the value that we can add to that is to keep things on track and not let things wander. So I love that. Probably a conversation for another time to talk about perhaps assertiveness or the perceived authority and how to pull that back and forth. But with that, Michael, I've got one final question. Ask everyone that comes on the show. I think I asked you this last time you came on, but I can't remember your answer. And that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling? In fact, no, I can see you smiling, so I think you probably did answer this last time. If you could go back...
I didn't.
Okay, I'll ask you straight up then. If you go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
I'm smiling because I'm thinking about my younger self and I can only give him one piece of advice. I might need to lock him into a room and spend a couple of days with him. But I think if I was going to give my younger self, a piece of advice as it regards to selling would be, it's our job to educate people and give them a reason. I think in my younger years, especially in business, I worked for an organization that was literally the top of the mountain in their industry. So in a lot of ways, and this is a compliment to them, selling to them meant showing up. And I didn't know any different. So selling to me meant showing up. And then obviously as time went on and context and things change, really, I think the sooner I could have learned to accept the fact that people have more motivation not to do what I want than to do what I want, then that would have changed my approach and led to some earlier opportunities or wins that I didn't have, as opposed to walking in with that, I'm the greatest, we're the greatest, of course they want to do this. And then I'm sitting there going, well, what just happened? Because I couldn't even fathom the fact that they wouldn't want to do that. So I really think that just internalizing the fact that it's okay to believe that we're still great and we're still what the customer needs, but they have plenty of motivation not to do this, helps reset our approach and focus on being more educational and value driven as opposed to pitchy or convincing or bragging.
I love this. So that's exactly the experience I had. I've worked in both my medical device sales jobs. We're both with the top kind of industry leading. Everyone wanted the products or services. I literally would wave my badge at a theatre door and be welcomed into 99% of different hospitals. And surgeons wanted you to come into the operating room because they knew they'd get to play with new toys. So that was my experience until I started this business. And I'd ring up whoever, sales training companies, whoever it was, SaaS, marketing and sales technology companies. I'd be, hey, I've got a podcast. And it literally this happened so many times. They turn around and go, who are you? What's a podcast? That was my experience for at least the first 6 months. And it knocked a whole bunch of edge off me from this, not necessarily cocky, but the confidence that I went into entrepreneurship and selling my own product and service on the back of. So totally on board with that, Michael. And with that, mate, tell us where we can find out more about you and the training you offer, because there's not been any question that I've asked you this podcast episode, this session, that you've not come back with an amazing answer. So I'm sure the audience are going to want to learn how they can kind of learn more about you and everything that you do as well.
I appreciate you asking. Thank you. They can find more about me in the seminars we offer and the advisory sessions we offer, which we customize industry agnostic for. Really, like what we talked about, context is king. So it's really imperative that we know to drive whatever we're doing home for the context. But they can find more at inquasive.com, INQUASIVE.com. That's where they can find a lot, not only of what we do, but samples of our content as well are on there for them. And then if anyone would love to connect on social media, they can find me on LinkedIn, Michael Reddington, CFI. I'd certainly love to connect and answer any questions that people have.
Amazing stuff. Well, I'll link to that in the show notes to this episode over at salesman.org. And with that, Michael, we'll definitely have you on in the future. There's a bunch of topics that bounce around my head. I've got notes here that we didn't even get to. So we'll get to some more of these in the not too distant future. And with that, I want to thank you again for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you for the invitation. Stay safe. I appreciate it.